Okay. Hi, everyone. Welcome to our Parsha class. My name is Sofia. I am the Maharat ASBI intern. We have our weekly Parsha class. For those of you who are new to the game, the way that this Parsha class works is we look at a section from our Parsha. We then see a piece of Gemara that quotes that part of the Parsha in a way that might be a little bit unusual or a way that maybe is out of context. Then we'll see maybe there's some significance to that happening, and maybe it'll give us a whole new way to be thinking about the Parsha. Okay, and on that note, now I will share my screen. I will also put the link to the class in the chat. Okay. Perfect. All right, I will share. Awesome. Okay, hopefully everyone can see. Okay, so this week's Parsha is Parsha Terumah. Last week we talked a little bit about the shift in narrative. We had so many amazing stories leading up to now, and then it's a bunch of laws. And here in these next few Parshiot, it's not just a bunch of laws, but it's a lot of laws about the Mishkan or the tabernacle, which is pretty foreign to us in our modern sensibilities of worship. But hopefully by looking at some interesting ways the Gemara thinks about some of these passages, we'll be able to think more about how this can apply to our own lives today. So to start off, we're going to look at the Tanakh sources, and then we'll get into the Gemara and lots of interesting discussion, I think, there will be. So please be ready to participate, ask questions. Let's get to it. Okay. So this is the beginning of the Parsha, Parsha Terumah. I will read in Hebrew and translate the rest as we go along. V'daber Adonai el Moshe lemor. Pretty self-explanatory. God speaks to Moshe. Daber el bnei Yisrael v'yikhu li truma me'et kol ish asher yidvenu libo tiklu et trumati. Tell bnei Yisrael that they should take gifts to give to me. Everyone will take from what they're able to contribute to. And interesting that the English here says from every person whose heart is so moved to give gifts to me. Okay, what are we going to do with these gifts? So I don't know what your gifts are like, but we're thinking pretty snazzy over here. We're thinking of gifts that are gold, silver, and bronze. Okay, we have a few more. Blue, purple, and crimson yarns, fine linen, goat's hair. That's not my version of gifts nowadays, but I guess that was theirs. Tanned ram skins, dolphin skins, and acacia wood. Shemen lamaor besamim l'shemen hamishcha v'liktoret hasamim. Oil for lighting, spices for the anointing oil and for the aromatic scents. Avnei shoham v'avnei miluim v'ephod u'lechoshen lapis lazuli, and other stones for setting, for the ephod and for the breastpiece. And they will make for me a sanctuary and I will dwell among them. Maybe, I don't know, this isn't in the ASBI synagogue, but maybe in other synagogues you've been to, on the Aron often it'll say because it's a really nice idea that we make a space to worship God and then God comes to us, which is a really nice image, a theological image that God meets us where we're at as opposed to us having to go to God. So this is like the part of the first Aliyah, pretty self-explanatory, that they're giving gifts in order to create the Mishkan, the tabernacle. These were probably like rarities at the time. Actually, and this might come up in next week's Parsha class, a lot of the things that they list here, Tchelet Vargaman, like these crimson yarns and things like that, are actually, they appear in the story that we have about when Achashverosh throws this great big party. Like, that's an interesting way to be thinking about what the tabernacle was like. But what I think is interesting here, and this is what the Gemara is going to pick on, is the second verse, that speaking to Bnei Israel to bring God gifts. What they're going to focus on is who exactly is giving gifts to contribute to the Beit HaMikdash, to the Mishkan, and then also this will help us think about the Beit HaMikdash, the temple, for later on. So this is our Tanakh source. It's pretty self-explanatory, I would say. The Gemara is going to become much more complicated and I think open up like a whole new can of worms about what exactly is expected in the giving of these things, and what maybe the relationship is between us and God and what the role of the Mishkan is. And that's what I hope to explore with us today. So I'm going to skip to the Gemara source now. Also post in the chat the link again, because wow, we have lots of people here today, which is really nice. Okay.
Yeah. Wow.
So the Gemara source that we're going to be looking at today is from Masachet Avodah Zarah. We have looked at it before in this class because there are lots of amazing discussions about the nature of the relationship between Jews and non-Jews in this Masachet. It's not a how-to guide. That's what people often joke, that Masachet Avodah Zarah is not a how-to in order to do idol worship, but it's more, here are the things you should avoid. But it leads to a lot of really interesting discussions about what kind of benefit can we have from idol worship. Idol worshippers are all non-Jews. Idol worshippers, some really interesting dialogue about how we should relate to people outside of our community. And I think that the text that we're going to look at that brings in our source is a really interesting back and forth about this. So I'm going to go to the English just for the sake of simplicity. If there are any clarification questions that people want on the way, you're welcome to raise your hand or write in the chat, and we'll hopefully have an interesting discussion as we go along. Okay. So we're going to jump into the Gemara here. The Gemara is going to be, was initially talking about the red heifer, the Para Aduma. The Para Aduma is a very unusual ritual that's mentioned actually in Sefer Bamidbar. We got a few books away until we get there. But it was the ritual about you became in contact with the dead. It's also a whole other shiur about why was ancient Israel like so concerned about purity and impurity around death. There have been many interesting academic articles written about it. Lots of ancient Near Eastern communities were very uncomfortable with death and found the need to purify themselves whenever they were in contact with it. And this is our ritual, that they would have a red heifer. Make sure that it was completely red, no white hairs or anything like that. And this is what would be sacrificed and burnt into ashes. And then those ashes, you would get those ashes, and then you would then become purified from tumat meat, from impurity of death. But the Gemara is talking about how do we know that a red heifer needs to come from an Israelite farm and not a non-Jewish one? So we're jumping into that question. This falls into the larger discussion in Masachet Avodah Zarah about how to relate to Jews and non-Jews. What can we buy from them that can benefit us ritually, whatnot? Okay, that's where we're starting off. Earlier on in the passage, Shela provided a rationale for Rabbi Eliezer's ruling that a red heifer may not be purchased from Gentiles. The Gemara examines the matter itself. Shela teaches in a Braita. What is the reasoning of Rabbi Eliezer? That Rabbi Eliezer says you can't buy red heifer from non-Jew. As it is written, speak unto the children of Israel that they take for you a red heifer. This indicates that the children of Israel take a red heifer, but Gentiles do not take a red heifer. So they're looking at the verse from Bamidbar. It says, speak to Bnei Israel, and not non-Jews. That's how they're reading it. Okay. But now we're going to look at our verse that we had all the way back when we were reading the Tanakh source, because it's kind of similar. But the Gemara asks, if that is so, then when the verse states with regard to the donations for the temple, speak unto the children of Israel that they may take from me an offering. So too, one can claim that only the children of Israel take an offering from God, but the Gentiles do not take an offering, and that no items for the temple service may be purchased from Gentiles. So what we're doing here is a kind of a Gzeira Shava. This is when we've encountered this idea before in this class, where we have two verses that have similar terms. And then when we have one rule from one, we can infer that rule into the other one. So they're focusing here on speak unto the children of Israel, Daber el bnei Israel is exactly the same as our verse. And so if there, it means that you only are supposed to be getting the red heifer from a Jew, that means that all temple donations seem to only be from Jews as well. That is typical use of Gemara logic, where we're taking one case and then applying the rules from one case to another case. Okay. So that seems to be what we're going for, but the way the Gemara is setting this up is that we're going to challenge that now. Is that really true, that only Jews can give to the temple? And if you would indeed say that this is so, this can't be correct. We're going to have a contradictory source that says otherwise. But doesn't Rabbi Yehuda say that Shmuel says, the sages asked Rabbi Eliezer, to what extent must one exert himself to fulfill the mitzvah of honoring one's father and mother? Rabbi Eliezer said to them, go and see for what a certain Gentile did for his father in Ashkelon. And his name was Dama ben Tina. So what we have here is we're using a story that we're actually going to learn something implicitly from the story. The story is actually about Kibud Avim, about respecting one's parents, but we're going to see built into the story, we're going to learn something about non-Jews and the temple. So what's it going to be? There was a Gentile named Dama ben Tina, and he was from Ashkelon, and let's see what he did for his father. Once, The sages sought to purchase precious stones from him for the ephod of the high priest for 600,000 gold dinar profit. And Rav Kahana teaches it was 800,000 dinar profit. So we saw this in the verse. We have the ephod, which is the breastplate. If you've ever seen a picture of a Kohen, they have like these great kids books about like what it used to look like in the tabernacle to imagine. But there's Molly, who's on this call from ASVI. She actually has a costume of the Kohen Gadol that she wears sometimes, and it also has the ephod. So if you ever need a reference, you should talk to her about it. The breastplate has 12 different stones, and they represent the 12 tribes. And so what we're seeing here is that this non-Jew, Dama ben Natina, had precious stones, and that we bought them from him, which is going to ultimately be the problem, right? Because we just learned that you shouldn't buy from non-Jews. And then there's a very classic Talmudic situation where the rabbis are fighting. Oh, how much money was each one? Some people say it was 600,000, and then some people say it was 800,000. Okay. Now let's continue. But the keys to the chest holding the jewels were placed under his father's head, and he would not disturb him. So remember earlier, this Gemara was talking about, we were trying to learn that non-Jews, this specific non-Jew, was doing kibbud av v'em, respecting one's father and mother. And so this is what we see here. He was so respectful to his father that his father slept with the keys under his pillow, and he didn't want to disturb him. Okay, so that's like a beautiful story. But what do we learn implicitly from this? That we saw that we were going to ask a non-Jew for stones that would then help the temple service, which seems to be a contradiction to what we said before, that Jews would be the ones, only people that could contribute to the temple. So there's our contradiction. We've taken a story that's not really about what we're talking about, but we've learned something from it, and we have a problem. Should Jews be the only ones to contribute to the temple or not? The Gemara is then going to do something that is a very Talmudic logic thing to do. It's going to do a very close reading of the verses that we have from the beginning of the Parsha for Parsha Terumah and come up with a solution. So what does it say? The Gemara answers that the phrase onyx stones concluded discussion of that matter. So what they're looking at, I'll take us all the way up to the beginning of the source so we can see what they did here, because not all of us have all of Torah memorized. What they're focusing on here is Avnei Shoham, right? This is those onyx stones. Everything else that was listed has a vav connecting them all. So it seems that what they're doing here is that this initial clause of saying that everyone from the Jews, from the Israelites, needs to give, and the Jews only. Each thing has a vav before, which seems to such it's connected, but the Avnei Shoham doesn't have. So what they're noticing is that because this one lacks a vav, the rules aren't the same. So that one gets to be donated by non-Jews, the other ones do not. Okay, interesting Talmudic read there. And that's how they solve it. But what's going to be the problem as they go on, and this basically summarizes the Gemara that we have here, is that they're going to continue doing these close readings and going back and forth and seeing that doesn't really work. So the takeaway from this Gemara section, this is, I guess, where the discussion opens, is what they're struggling with here is the idea that can non-Jews contribute to the temple? And they seem to initially suggest no, and then they start realizing there are these different stories, different opinions out there that seem to suggest otherwise, and it doesn't really have a clear answer, which is like pretty typical for Gemara, that you would be having these backs and forths, and there isn't a direct conclusion. But it seems to be a struggle with what's going on. They first hear that Jews are the only ones who can contribute to the temple, and then these contradicting stories come in. I also think that what's interesting about the story that they decide to choose about kibbud av v'em, of respecting one's father and mother, seems to also, like, in case we weren't sure if maybe the exclusionary aspects of like non-Jews helping to contribute meant that was something, a judgment of their character, we now have this beautiful story about a non-Jew that really respects their parents. Yeah, Marilyn, do you want to share something?
Aren't they talking about buying precious stones from non-Jews? So they're not contributing, they're selling.
Yeah, that's a good point. So within Masechet Avodah Zarah itself, there is I think this would be like a good, you could be in the Gemara, Marilyn. You could say that, well, we were talking about things that are nediv libo, that are voluntary, and this is buying. But within Masechet Avodah Zarah itself, there's a lot of discussion about what kind of benefit you can have from non-Jews, which includes monetary benefit. Can they benefit from something that you also benefit from, which would then be financial transaction? But I think that's a really fantastic answer as well. maybe volunteering would be different than us buying off of them themselves. I still think we have to like reckon with this issue of like, well, why are we feeling so exclusionary towards non-Jews? If non-Jews wanted to contribute to the temple, like why would that be so bad? But yeah, I'm curious. This is where we open it up to the floor. I'm curious, one, like what do you make of this whole interaction of the potential exclusionary ramifications of this? That the story that they provide is then the story of Kibbutz Av V'Aim. It's an interesting mixture of things. Yeah, Barry, start us off.
I'm back at Yam Suf, and I'm back at the departure from the land of Egypt on the way to Yam Suf, and that circuitous path we took, and that we came out with nothing in terms of our own gifts, jewels, wealth, things like that. We were suggested that God suggested to Moshe to suggest to us that on our way out, we ask our neighbors to give us what they can give us. And they did. And at Yam Suf, we learned from commentary, at least I do, from Rashi commentary, that the horses of Pharaoh and his army were decorated more beautifully and more richly than even the people in Egypt had in their houses. So Moshe had to eventually pull us away from the seashore, from grabbing all that booty. So we came out with nothing. What we acquired was all from the Egyptians, one way or another, and that was that. So I'm thinking originally, it's not where it's not that Goyim, whether it be Egyptians or Dama ben Natina, or who acquires these things and has them in their possession. I think it's what we do them when they come into our possession. God tells Moshe, tell the children of Israel to bring gifts. But so I think it's not so much how we acquire them, whether we buy them from these people or take them as booty from the dead soldiers and horses at the seashore, or what. I think it's we give them without price. We don't take back compensation for giving them. It's our gift to the temple. How we came upon it is from the spoils of coming out of slavery.
Wow, that's a really interesting point. Right. I think that, like, I was joking about this at the beginning when they were listing what would be the things that they would give as volunteer gifts. And I was like, oh, everyone has their gold, silver, and bronze just lying around. But you actually bring out the point, which is that that's not what was just lying around. They actually took it from the Egyptians because that was what they were given as compensation for slavery, like a few parshiot ago. And then that gets back to Marilyn's point of, well, that means that actually those things are now in Israelite possession, but they originally were from Egyptians. So I think that this is all of a very useful muddying of the point. Like, we think that it's like coming in to be strictly exclusionary, and then all of a sudden there are all these other factors coming that really do not seem to make it black and white. And also your point, Barry, about like, what do we do when we have the thing, and it's about what we decide to do with it as opposed to the thing itself. I think that that's a discussion that comes out throughout a lot of Masechet Avodah Zarah. Earlier in this passage in Avodah Zarah, there's a lot of amazing discussions about if Jews can go to the circus or if Jews can go to the gladiator stadium. It came up actually in the news recently because a lot of rabbis have thoughts about if Jews should be watching the Super Bowl or not, and they're talking about comparing the Super Bowl to some of these things. It's an interesting modern discussion. My Rosh Yeshiva from Maharat actually is very anti people watching the Super Bowl because he thinks that like it's a manifestation of gore and violence in this world today. That's like a whole other shiur in and of itself. Absolutely. But this was Reb Jeffrey Fox. So the reason why I mention it though is because in those discussions, a lot of what the Gemara is struggling with is the issue going to these places and then being influenced by the people, or maybe you need to do your own inner work to make sure that like you can properly filter out the good and the bad. And I think that's what Barry reminded me of with some of these materials. It's about what you decide to do with them. If you get materials from a seemingly questionable place, if we're using them for the sake of the temple, that's pretty great. So yeah, thank you. Anyone else want to share? There's lots to talk about in this passage. So yeah, feel free to jump in. Otherwise, I'll share my thought. We'll move on.
Please.
Okay. Well, what I think is interesting here, and I alluded to it before, but since this class is an opportunity to be thinking about like what is the Talmud doing in general, is I think that the way that we often think about the Gemaras, we often think about it as a lot of rules. However, when you look at it, in fact, the Gemara is both rules and stories. If you actually, I think someone measured it that 1/3 of the Talmud is all Agadah, which is these like legends, stories. They usually come with some kind of didactic purpose. And it's very interesting then when halacha and Agadah intersect. There's a whole book, I'm looking at it, you can't see it, but I'm looking at it here, called Narrating the Law by Barry Scott Wimpheimer. I know people really liked book suggestions last time, so I'll mention another book.
You know Barry.
Exactly. And this book does a really interesting job at seeing when Talmudic stories interweave with Talmudic law, and then one wonders how one is supposed to affect the other. If we were just looking at this story from a legal perspective, we'd see non-Jews are not included in this experience. And then all of a sudden we throw in this story that like changes the way that we think about it. And not only that, it portrays non-Jews in a beautiful light. And so one wonders then, how is a story, we're going to come in with our own biases, and of course this is going to affect us. How are we going to read this and then maybe feel like maybe the halakha needs to come out a bit softer? And so that's a lot of what the book is about, is when those things happen together. Another example that actually, it comes up in the introduction of the book, is a connection to Purim. There's a mitzvah on Purim that you have to drink until you don't know the difference between Haman and Mordechai, which is a pretty crazy rule. And right afterward, there's a story about Rava and Rabbi Zera doing just that. And then Rava kills Rabbi Zera because he's so drunk.
Oh no.
So one wonders, what's the point of that story? It seems that story is trying to tone down the halakha. So this is just an interesting manifestation of that principle. Yeah, so lots of interesting things here. What I want to explore more is the idea of the exclusionary aspects of the temple. Personally, the idea of Jewish chosenness has been something that has bothered me ever since I was in high school. I think that it's beautiful that we are God's chosen people, but the idea that people outside of the Jewish faith would not necessarily have the same opportunity to tap into God made me very upset. So that might be why this topic is interesting to me. And I want to explore some other sources that kind of talk about it, and maybe we can think about the ramifications of that. What does it mean for all of us to be God's creation? And then what does it mean for us to be singled out? So that's what we're going to do now in the takeaway. Okay. So we just saw these sources that seem to suggest that from a legal standpoint, maybe Jews are the only people who can contribute to the temple. But there's this amazing Mishnah in Masechet Yoma. Yoma is a Masechet all dedicated to the laws of Yom Kippur. The Mishnayot are pretty easy to understand, and if you're ever bored and hungry on Yom Kippur, I highly recommend reading them. They walk through the entire temple service on that day in a way that's pretty dramatic. And something that they mentioned, since they're talking about the temple service, they just start talking about other things that are happening in the temple. And they start listing different people that dedicated certain things to the temple. And the one that's the most interesting to me, we'll skip down to the bottom, is Queen Helen, which we're going to go to from here. So it says, Queen Helen, his mother, King Munbaz, who we were talking about before, fashioned a decorative gold chandelier above the entrance of the sanctuary. She also fashioned the golden tablet, Tavla, on which the Torah portion relating to the Sota was written. The tablet could be utilized to copy the Torah portions, that a Torah scroll need not be taken out for that purpose. And then all these other things about magical things that used to happen at the temple. It's pretty fun. Okay, so Queen Helen is not Jewish, and yet she dedicates this golden chandelier to be the entrance of the sanctuary. And she also dedicates this tablet for the Sota ritual, which was to catch a woman who was being adulterous with her husband. There has to be writing of the passage, sprinkling into water, making her drink it, a whole other story. But she also provided that financially. And this is just mentioned in the Mishnah. And I think it's a very interesting contrast to what we saw before, that maybe non-Jews should not contribute. She is royalty, but we could probably turn her down. And yet this is in the Mishnah codified this way. And she's remembered for being this like amazing patron of the temple. And it seems clear to me here that this seems to be a suggestion that non-Jews are not only allowed, but welcome to be a part of our temple service together. What's interesting to note, though, is that then other historians and other commentators struggle with her being here. And they actually say, don't worry, she actually was Jewish. She converted. So this is after her conversion story. Josephus actually writes this, and Josephus, the historian, writes this. There are also some amazing stories about her taking on a Nazirite vow. And so that seems to be people struggling with, like, how is she not Jewish and still a part of our community and contributing this way? But I think that this is a really good snapshot in time of how a non-Jewish person was contributing in a beautiful way to temple service. And how does that then factor with everything else we saw? Okay, so there's that. The other sources I want to give are from the Tanakh. And I think that they're interesting because they provide a messianic vision of how temple worship is supposed to look. And they involve non-Jews as well. So this source is from Zechariah. We read it as Haftorah on Sukkot. You might recognize some of it because it appears in our Aleinu prayer. And this is how it goes. Vayah Adonai lamelech al kol haaretz bayom hahu yeh Adonai echad u'shmo echad. And the Lord shall be king over the earth. In that day there shall be one God with one name. Vayah kol hanotar mikol hagoyim habaim al Yerushalayim ve'alu midei shana b'shana lishtachavot lemelech Adonai tzvot v'lachog et chag haSukkot. All those who survive, this is after a lot of fighting at the end of days. That's what we skipped. All those who survive of all those nations that came up against Jerusalem to make a pilgrimage year by year, to bow low to the King, Lord of hosts, and to observe the Feasts of Booths. They come on Sukkot. This is why we read it for the Sukkot Haftorah. Vayasher lo yaleh me'it mishpachot ha'aretz el Yerushalayim mishtachavot lemelech Adonai tzvot v'lo alehem yeh hagashem. Any of the earth's communities that does not make the pilgrimage to Jerusalem to bow low to the King, Lord of hosts, shall receive no rain. So not only are non-Jews welcome to come to the temple, but they actually will be not punished, but they'll receive negative ramification if they don't come. The benefit of going to the temple for the holiday of Sukkot is there were all of these libations. That was the way that the theological framework of Bnei Israel at that time was that if they do those things, that they'll ensure rain for their crops. And non-Jews are welcome to come. And if they don't come, actually, they will not get rain. So it seems clear to me here that non-Jews are a part of the process. The last source, and then we can open it up for discussion again, just to kind of paint this messianic vision even more so. This also comes from liturgy. The end source appears often in Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur liturgy. ובני נכר הנלווים אל אדוני לשרתו ולאהבה את שם אדוני, להיות לו לעבדים, כל שומר שבת מחללו ומחזקים בבריתי. As for the foreigners who attach themselves to the Lord, to minister to him, and to love the name of the Lord, to be his servants, all those who keep the Shabbat and do not profane it, and those who hold fast to my covenant, v'aviotim el har kodeshi v'simachtim b'veit tefilati, olotehem v'zivchechem l'ratzon al mizbechi, ki veiti veit tefila yikarei l'chol ha'amim. I will bring them to my sacred mount and let them rejoice in my house of prayer. Their burnt offerings and sacrifices shall be welcome on my altar, for my house shall be called a house of prayer for all people. So here, not only is it the non-Jews, but it actually is saying, like, we're stressing even the non-Jews who do not keep my laws, yet get to come here and come sacrifice and be a part of worship together. So with all of those sources together, I'm curious how seeing these sources from Tanakh maybe help us think differently about the Talmud sources. And these sources are also messianic. These are about what will happen in the future. And what about them being messianic can then help us learn more about universalism and particularism in that way. I'm curious for people's thoughts.
I had a comment. My brother goes to a Reformed temple in Fayetteville, Arkansas. And they used to meet like at Hillel, or maybe if there was a bar mitzvah and they needed more space, they meet at a Unitarian church. Well, there's a general contractor who's Muslim. He donated all of his time for them to build a building of their own. He, the temple had to pay for the materials, and they had to pay for the subcontractors, but anything that the general contractor, any work that he did, was all voluntary.
Yeah, similarly, the Eitz Chaim on a Sefer Torah at my shul like broke, and then I volunteered my father, who's like a decent woodworker, like my father's not Jewish, so like I offered him up to make a new one because he would do it for free. And then when I told my dad about it, he was the one. I don't think there would be an issue with it. Even my dad was like, am I allowed to do that because I'm not Jewish? And I was like, oh, I don't know. Like my rabbi didn't say anything. So I checked with my rabbi and he was like, no, it's fine. But like, I would never think, like, I would never have thought that it wouldn't be okay. So it's interesting. Yeah. I don't know. Sorry, that does not answer your question about universalism, but
a story in and of itself is an answer. So what both you and Marilyn reminded me of is I went to Camp Stone. It's a B'nai Akiva camp in Lancaster County, which is Amish town, and the Amish people are like deep partnership with the camp, and they actually help keep the camp running while we're not there for 10 months a year. And it's like really funny because when I was teaching a lot of the kids there, they'd see the Amish people in their buggies walk by and they'd go, whoa, like, Sophia, can you tell me more about these ultra Orthodox Jews that live here? And I was like, no, not the same thing. But they were like really in not just like with us in partnership, but they helped build our own Kodesh. They like really were contributing. And it was a really beautiful moment of coexistence. So yeah, Marilyn, your example from Arkansas, Anna, your point, like this, I mean, maybe we can wonder like throughout history, has it always been this way? But to think now that we do live in a time in which like we can have these kinds of relationships with each other, I think is beautiful. So thank you for the stories. I think that the stories in and of itself might give us a bit of an answer. Yeah, Barry, go for it.
I don't have a story per se, but a historical perspective kind of. At some point, we know the Torah is not necessarily chronological, but we do know that after the golden calf, Moshe has to go upstairs and go up to the mount with the tablets that he carved out from the quarry. He got rich off of that, by the way, according to Rashi commentary. And so he goes up to the har. And one of the things he prays for while he's getting this favor from God, if you will, was he wants to see God's glory. And God, of course, says, no, I can't do that because, I wouldn't do that to you, Moshe, because no person can see my face and die and live. So how about if I just shield you and you can see the rush after I pass by, and that's as close as you can get to my glory. But then Moshe bargains that we should be God's special people, and to the exclusion of the other nations. But that's at a point in time, whatever the point in time that is. We know the relativity of the point, but so there it is happening at the har, and then and that's like us for the rest of our travails through the wilderness, while we're trying to earn back our stripes to cross the Jordan River. So, but later on now, if a Navi is getting a vision at some point, and it's messianic, post-messianic, then timing becomes everything, because already we've been established at that point, presumably, that we are God's people, but there are additions to us. There's been additions to us all the time in terms of actual converts, people in our midst who convert to Judaism and become us. But at this point, if it's messianic, then the house of all peoples becomes a much more of a relevant thing to God, and much less of a loss to us, because we're already there. We're already there. We've been there, and we're hanging in there with, and we're seeing this evolve, and hopefully we're prevailing after Gog versus Magog, and that's where I think this is going, is it becomes a timing thing, that it's time now to seek universality. That's where I am with all this. I'm okay with this.
Oh, good. Barry, I know it's a high bar to make sure that's okay with you.
No, it's-
Yeah, a few
Thank you.
things stick out to me about what you said.
I see the humor.
First is, we've studied this Rashi many times in this class before, I think, because I really like this Rashi. But the first Rashi on all of Torah is the question of, why are we starting with the creation story? Like, we should just start with the rules. Let's go. And Rashi doesn't give the answer that I would like him to give, because he starts talking about, oh, we need to show that the land belongs to us in case people question if we should be there one day. Okay, we can bracket that part. But the question is fantastic. Like, why are we starting here? And it seems that there is a desire for some kind of universality, to see that our story is somehow also the creation of the world's story, and vice versa. But then I think a point that you bring out about this tension that arises is this amazing story from Parsha Kitisa, which is in 2 Parshot from now. It's like beautiful moment of intimacy between God and Moshe, where Moshe's like, I want to know you. I want to understand who you are and what you are to me. And it's kind of hard to do that en masse. It's like much easier to do that in a particular sense. And so then when we think about chosenness, that like there's only one nation that can do that, is that like a choosing of a preference of one over the other, or is that like in order to develop deep connection, like doing it with one group is the only way to do that? To tie that all together, since those are like two different points, and to connect back to your point about universalism at the end, Barry, is that Rav Menachem Leibtag of Yeshiva Har Etzion talks a lot about chosenness as paradigm, that it's there to be a model for other people to like look into, not necessarily to convert, but just to like see like this is a way that that God connects with the world, and to see that the model of chosenness as more like a pedagogical tool, as opposed to a statement of like, haha, I'm better than all of you. It's easier to look at a model and then think like, this is why it's the case, as opposed to some sense of elitism. And then having the messianic vision be universalism validates that like ultimately it's really about all of us being able to connect to God. So yeah, thank you. Does anyone else have any thoughts, qualms, questions they want to share?
I have one more addendum, if you will.
Sure. And if anyone else
okay.
wants to share, you're welcome to
please.
share afterwards. Go for it.
Please. I'm reminded, as I even spoke for myself, that we see this also in Torah as well, and I forgot where, but it's when we are established as a nation in the land, and seafarers particularly, but others who come to visit us, doing commerce, doing business with us, and they get to our shores, they get into our land, they're doing business with us, and while they're here, they want to see what it is that all this reputation is about, the Beit HaMikdash, these people. So they want to visit the Beit HaMikdash and see what it is that is, what's the hype about us, what's the story, and they come and they see, and they are impressed. And the open-minded, open-eyed people who come and observe and see, wow, what an amazing people this must be, to be of this mind and be of this devotion, to pay attention to these rules and these ways that they've received from God and all that. So we see that in Torah. It's just not, it's not just centrally in one place, and it's not just in the Nevi'im, and it's just not always in the Haftorah. It's dispersed, but it's around.
Right. I don't remember the story about people. Oh, maybe people coming in Malachim Aleph, when like the Queen of Sheba, like all of these like people come to see King Solomon. Maybe I think there are ships there, so it could be that. But even last,
I'm pretty sure it's in Torah too, because it talks about the seashore people.
I'll have to check.
Yeah, I know. I forgot where it was, but I'm pretty sure I've seen it in Torah.
Well, I think even what came to mind when you were saying that was even 2 parts ago when we had Yitro come in and say, like, Moshe's father-in-law, who was the high priest of Midian, like come in and be like, whoa, this is amazing that the sea split. Like I have to come see what this is all about. I wonder also if part of it is like the way that we view religion now might be different than how they viewed it then. Like for us seeing it as more doctrinal, more sectarian, well, for them to like see God anywhere like that was just exciting. And that maybe there's like polytheism was very common at the time and idol worship was very common, but part of why it was common is I think there was this idea of like, if you see God here, God there, like let's just like put my whole pantheon together in my, altar in my house. Like, why not take every glean from anywhere? And this idea of like a strict binary of like either you're in or you're out, like might have not actually been how they viewed religion at the time, like seeing religion as this like distinct like set of laws and expectations. So it makes sense that there would be lots of non-Jews that would come want to see what it's all about.
I mean, it may have been described in commentary, but it was at that point in Torah where they were talking about people's coming to do business with us by the seashore and then wanting to come in and see what was going on.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, thanks.
Any other thoughts anyone wants to share? Awesome. Well, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Okay. Wow, we have like a big group tonight. This is nice. I think it's very important to have this conversation about universalism and particularism. I think that within the Orthodox world, there's a lot of tunnel vision about a lot of this. The amount of people that, even like meeting non-Jews, it doesn't necessarily happen when you're like stuck through the day school system. And I did a lot of interfaith work when I was in college. And I think that's like what really kind of opened my mind to a lot of this. And I think seeing this question of universalism and particularism not as a binary, but seeing as actually some of both of those things are within our tradition, I think is really exciting. I think like throwing away binaries is always like a healthier way to be seeing the world. But also it makes me like more theologically happy to like think like in light of my high school self being concerned about chosenness, to think that there could be other models out there or simultaneous models, and to think that there's a messianic vision in which we're all together and asking for rain together. I mean, wanting rain is a universal need and not just a Jewish one. To think that we have access to God regardless of who we are, I think is very special. And even within the Talmudic sources that we saw that Queen Helene was, donating her fantastic chandelier. I think that is a really beautiful idea. And for me, seeing the verses in the Parsha doesn't feel so relevant to me initially, not really living in a temple world anymore, but recognizing that it can be a jump off starting point of discussion of issues that do matter today, or I think should matter today, is very exciting for me and makes me excited to think there's so many different layers of Torah to learn. So hopefully that was somewhat conveyed this evening. And thank you so much for coming. And I'm excited for next week. We'll be doing some more stuff about the temple because that's Parsha Tetzaveh. If you ever need to be in contact in between, my email address was on the sheet, but I will put it here if you would like to speak with me. I'm happy. I know a lot of people wanted the book recommendation last time. If you'd like, you're welcome to send me. I can tell you all about Narrating the Law by Barry Scott Winfrimer. And
he used to attend Shul. He used to attend.
Yes, right. He's in Chicago. I forgot about. Yeah,
he
he's
used to attend Anshe Shalom, and then he left us.
Well, now I know who I'm getting coffee with next time I'm there. So, yeah, that's good call.
He's brilliant. Great.
Amazing. Okay, have a good evening, everyone. Be well.
Sophia, do you have a minute after class?
Yes, I'm happy to stay on. I'll stop the recording.
Thanks.